Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, Professor.
I'm sorry I was a little bit late because for some reason my computer today is extremely slow. Took me about 3 minutes to actually download Zoom for some reason. I don't know why it's happening, but it is what it is. Okay, today I guess, well, before we start, does anyone have any questions regarding what we covered so far? Okay, then what we're going to do today is we're going to continue with chapter 9. Hopefully, we should be able to finish this chapter today. We really don't have that much left, especially with the notes that I have posted for you. That should be a great help. Now, obviously, you really need to read the chapter as well. So just don't depend only on the lectures or on the notes. You got to read the chapter yourself and supplement that with the notes and with whatever we say here. That should give you a much better picture of what's going on in the MENA region. And that also should help you understand exactly the dynamics that are involved in the uh, political, economic, and social developments that pertain to the MENA region. So all of those things are extremely important, and I always emphasize this, to all the classes that I had in political economy of MENA. It's all about readings, basically. So in the other economic subjects. It's all about homework. It's all about solving problems. But unfortunately, when it comes to a subject like the political economy of the MENA region, the best way to actually do well in this course is through reading and through pretty much having a good idea of what transpires in the MENA region. And you can only do that through reading, basically. So, yeah, I do highly recommend that you read the chapters as much as possible. Of course, you have to. And also, try on your spare time to do your own research. Basically, it's not that difficult nowadays to actually do your own research on certain topics on the MENA region. All what you need to do is just go to Google, and it will give you so many sources that you can look into. Anyway, so having said that, today what we want to do is we really want to look at an important phenomenon, basically the Dutch disease and what it means. Sometimes I refer to it as the double D, the Dutch disease, but um, it's one of those things that have affected oil producing countries basically. And it all started in the 1970s. This term, as I'm sure most of you know by now, is a term that was actually coined by the economists. The Economist, which is a British magazine that is published, I believe, bi-weekly. And during the 1970s, they actually looked at Holland at the time. They were actually exploring for oil and natural gas, and they were very successful in drilling oil and getting natural gas as a result of that. And it obviously affected the Dutch economy tremendously in terms of pretty much affecting the exchange rate of the Dutch currency versus other currencies. That's basically what the Dutch disease is all about. It's creating an imbalance in the foreign exchange market with your domestic currency versus all other international currencies. Now, all of a sudden, when Holland saw a lot of this money come in, huge cash inflow as a result of selling oil, all of that money was pretty much spent, obviously, in the country, and it increased spending tremendously. And as a result, the exchange rate, obviously, in Holland was pretty much, in terms of competitiveness, was very much disfavorable to Holland. Why? For the simple reason because the Dutch um, currency, I don't remember what's the name of the Dutch currency, but the Dutch currency pretty much gained value versus foreign exchange because the demand for Dutch currency increased because a lot of these oil importers had to pay Holland in Dutch currency when they imported oil from Holland. So obviously, all of a sudden now, Holland finds itself flush with foreign currency, and as a result, the price of foreign currency fell relative to the price of the domestic currency, which made it a lot easier for Holland to actually import goods from overseas because now goods have become a lot cheaper importing goods from overseas rather than producing them at home. And this was a negative for the Dutch economy. In other words, all of a sudden you saw a huge decrease in the manufacturing sector and the agricultural sector. And that's pretty much put a strain on the Dutch economy, simply because it led to a lot of unemployment as a result of that. Um, the Dutch economy became less competitive with the rest of the world, and that's basically what oil did. And as a result, it came to be known as the Dutch disease. Now, in the MENA region, I don't see the Dutch disease in those terms. In other words, I don't see the currencies of the MENA region being affected as a result of oil production. And the reason is very simple, because these countries will sell oil for dollar. They don't sell oil for their domestic currencies. So the oil that they sell it for dollars. So in other words, the domestic currency does not get affected at all. The only way where it gets affected, and we will talk about this in just a few minutes, is basically, actually there are two places where it really gets affected. One is through huge government spending, which leads to inflation. Now, that's number one. That's how it would affect the macroeconomic balance within the region through inflation, inflationary pressure, simply because of this huge government spending as a result of getting so much money for oil. So that's number one. Number two, it also affects the allocation of resources, capital and labor. And we will see that in just a few minutes when we talk about the exchange rate in terms of tradables versus non-tradables. So those are the two avenues, the two channels that oil production or oil revenues happen to impact or influence the domestic macroeconomy of oil producing countries. And we will look at that in just a few minutes. But let's see now. Um, there's just one thing I would like to do here first. Okay, we got that. So let's go here and let's go there. Uh, Mhm. Again, it's very, very slow. I don't know why. It's like I said, it took me 5 minutes to actually get to the session, the Zoom session. But anyway, everyone can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
All right, so let us first now talk a little bit about the Dutch disease in terms of the exchange rate. Now, remember, those of you who have taken international economics with me, and I guess there are a couple of students here who have, you know, when we defined the real exchange rate, how we defined it. In other words, if you remember, we defined the real exchange rate simply to be the nominal exchange rate times the foreign price level divided by the domestic price level. So, in other words, when the price level at home increases relative to the foreign price level, this will reduce the real exchange rate. In other words, the real exchange rate falls by definition, because we define the real exchange rate as simply the nominal exchange rate times. So if some of you have a piece of paper there, you can write those down. Or we can write it here, you know, just in case. Let's write it here. And then we can take it out, no problem. Okay, let's say that the real exchange rate is equal to the nominal. So I'm not going to write the whole thing, just the nominal exchange rate. I just put E to represent the exchange rate divided by, times the domestic, the foreign price level. Let's put FPL, foreign price level, divided by domestic price level. Okay, so that's basically what the real exchange rate is. The real exchange rate is simply equal to the nominal exchange rate times the foreign price level divided by the domestic price level. Now, if we express this exchange rate as the domestic currency per foreign currency, then if we do that, then if the real exchange rate falls as a result of domestic price level increasing relative to the foreign price level, if that happens, if the domestic price level happens to increase relatively more than the increase in the foreign price level, if that happens, then we will have a fall in the real exchange rate. Now, what this fall in the real exchange rate means, it simply means that the domestic currency will now appreciate in value, which simply means now you will need fewer domestic currencies to purchase one foreign currency. That's what we mean when we say the real exchange rate falls, basically. It simply falls because now you need fewer domestic currency to purchase a given unit of foreign currencies. So, in other words, excuse me, in other words, what you have here is an appreciation in the domestic currency. Okay, everyone got that? This is basically how we define the real exchange rate. It's simply nominal exchange rate times the foreign price level divided by domestic price level. Okay, so let me take all of that out. Otherwise, it's not going to make any sense here reading all of that. So we're back to where we started. Okay, now having said that, of course, the going back to the exchange rate, which I explained here. Okay, the effect of oil on relative prices is extremely important. In other words, oil revenues will impact exchange rates. How will they do that? Well, as I have just defined it a few minutes ago, I defined exchange rate from the macro perspective. In other words, I pretty much defined the exchange rate in terms of um, foreign prices versus domestic prices. That's how we define the real exchange rate, basically. In other words, we take the nominal exchange rate and we adjust it for relative price differences, domestic versus international. But a more precise definition of the exchange rate is that of a micro perspective, not macro, which simply defines the exchange rate as the price of traded goods to the price of non-traded goods. So in other words, we're really not looking at the macro pictures of prices, but we're rather looking at the micro picture of prices. In other words, prices of tradables versus non-tradables within one country. We're really not going beyond that. We're really not comparing this with foreign prices, but we're simply looking at the price of tradable goods versus the price of non-tradable goods. So traded versus non-traded. Now, what is tradable goods? Tradable goods are simply goods that can be traded with other countries. In other words, manufacturing goods, agricultural goods, like, for example, wheat, computers, cars. All of these are tradable goods, goods that you can trade with other countries. Non-tradable goods are goods that you cannot trade with other countries. For example, we may take things such as construction, taxi cab rides. Most services basically are non-tradable, but construction is obviously not tradable. I mean, once you build a house and the house is going to stay there, you're not going to be able to trade it anywhere else. So the construction industry basically and the other service industry are pretty much non-tradable goods. And I guess the book, if you have read the book, it really, if my memory serves me right now, it really talks about wheat as a tradable good and labor as non-tradable. And here, of course, the labor that the author is using here is labor in civil service, basically. So he's obviously looking at the price of labor, which is wages, and the price of wheat, basically, and tries to compare those two. But let's see how this really fits in uh, to what we were actually saying. So assume that there are only two types of goods: those that are traded internationally and those that are not traded internationally. And here, of course, we can look at the exchange rate. The micro aspect of exchange rate can be defined in terms of the price of tradable goods versus the price of non-tradable goods. So in fact, you will see that governments in the MENA region spend a larger proportion of their oil revenues on non-tradable goods, such as construction, healthcare services, education, infrastructure, civil servants' wages. That's where most of the oil revenues go to, basically. It's mostly spent on non-tradable. This will obviously increase the price of the non-tradable goods relative to the price of the tradable goods, which will reduce the RER, or the real exchange rate. So you may want to write that down just in case you may forget it later on, what RER stands for: real exchange rate. It will reduce the real exchange rate and make the country less competitive with the rest of the world. So this is basically how oil will affect the real exchange rate by simply making the domestic currency a lot more expensive than the foreign currency. And as a result, this will give an incentive for those countries that happen to be producing oil to pretty much import all the tradable goods from overseas. Why would you want to produce them at home when you can buy them a lot cheaper? And pretty much focus on the non-tradables, basically. So that's what really happened in a lot of these um, oil producing countries, and all of this is basically known as the Dutch disease. So whenever you see the Dutch disease, you know exactly what it is. It simply looks at how oil revenues would affect the exchange rate, and as a result, would affect the price of non-tradables versus tradables. Now, if you look at the less developed countries, for example, and the MENA region is part of the less developed countries, you will see that the prices of non-tradables versus the prices of tradables happen to be very much different, for the simple reason because the prices of non-tradables are determined in international markets through high levels of competition. That's how prices of tradable goods are determined. So you will find that their prices are relatively lower, even though if they increase, they will not increase by as much as the increase in non-tradables. Whereas non-tradable prices are determined in domestic markets through demand and supply. Tradable are determined in international markets through demand and supply. And the market structure usually is highly competitive in international markets. Tradables is simply determined in domestic markets, not in international markets. And as a result, the market structure is less competitive. And also, you will see that the supply of tradable goods is highly elastic because there is ample supply of tradable goods. Whereas if you look at the supply of non-tradable goods, it's highly inelastic because there is so much available. Because here again, we're looking at a domestic market. We're not really looking at an international market. So any shock in the price, I'm sorry, any demand shock in either tradable or non-tradable. Let's say, for example, if there is an increase in demand for tradables, that increase in demand will increase price, but it will increase it by very little. Why? Because supply is highly elastic. But if you look at the non-tradables, any shock in demand, in other words, an increase in demand for non-tradables will increase prices tremendously. Why? Because the supply is highly inelastic. So those are the things that you really need to keep in mind in as far as tradable versus non-tradables and the dynamics of it all. So basically, the Dutch disease, in fact, happens to pretty much negatively affect the oil sectors in terms of having this huge impact on the real exchange rate, and as a result will force countries in the MENA region basically to import goods from outside rather than produce them at home, because producing them at home is extremely expensive. Like, for example, labor, price of labor would increase tremendously in the MENA region, because, as I said, those are part of the non-tradables. Prices will go up extremely high. Now, the prices of agricultural products and manufacturing products may also go up because of an increase in demand, but it will not go up as much as the cost of producing them. So what the Dutch disease would do here, in fact, it will lead to what we call rural exodus. In other words, you'll find a lot of people in the agricultural sector or in the rural areas or on the farm, leaving those areas and going to cities looking for jobs in the service and construction sector. Why? Because manufacturing and the agricultural sectors are pretty much squeezed in terms of their profit, because they see that the cost of inputs is extremely high, whereas prices have really not increased as much as the increase in the cost of inputs, and this will squeeze their profits. And as a result, a lot of these firms will shut down and farmers will quit producing agricultural goods. Workers will quit working there because there isn't much work. And so they will start to migrate to cities looking for service sector jobs in construction, in retail, and in different other services. And this is a problem. So actually what you're doing here with the Dutch disease, what it is doing, it is preventing the economy from diversifying. This is a big, big problem. So now all these economies are pretty much dependent on the service sector. They're pretty much stayed away from manufacturing and also from the agricultural sector. So this causes a problem. Okay, now, as I said right here, it pretty much the real exchange rate appreciation will deeply affect economic incentives. Why? Because it will lead to shift in resources. Because the price of non-tradables increases relative to the price of tradables. Because of that, you will see a shift in resources, labor and capital, in other words. going from tradable to the non-tradable. And that's exactly what I've said there. It will divert resources toward the non-tradable sector at the expense of the tradable sector. So that's basically this shift will force stagnation of the manufacturing and agricultural sectors and will further expand the already booming oil and construction sectors. So there is empirical evidence here that shows that this actually happened in the MENA region. Examples are Tunisia and Algeria. In other words, the agricultural and manufacturing sector in both Tunisia and Algeria were doing very, very well before the oil boom. And then once the oil boom came into effect, and also once Tunisia started producing oil, because Tunisia only started producing oil in the late 80s, early 90s. So once they did so, in as far as the agriculture and manufacturing, it pretty much declined tremendously. If you look at the agricultural sector and the manufacturing sector as a percentage of GDP in Tunisia, it went down drastically, which obviously accounts for the Dutch disease that we just talked about. The same thing happened in Algeria too, and also in other countries besides the MENA region, by the way. The same thing happened. And I guess here, if we look at real data on the growth of the different sectors, i.e. tradable versus non-tradables, we find, for example, that in Tunisia, agriculture during the 1970-81 grew at an average of 4.1%. That was before the discovery of oil. And then it grew only at 1.6% from 1970. I'm sorry, here, actually, it's there is probably not from 1973 to 1983, but a little bit later, probably, I don't know if there was a misprint on my part, or because I think I got this from the book anyway. And if that's the case, then there is a mistake right there, because I think the numbers fell down not from 1973 to 1983, but a little bit further down. In other words, we're talking about the 80s and 90s, I guess. I mean, probably from 83 to 93, maybe. But anyway, I just have to look into that a little bit more and do my own research, I guess, because I think that was given in the book. I was only able to realize this right now when I looked at it. But again, I think it should be a little bit further than the 73-83 range that agriculture went down. Because from 1970 to 81, it grew at 4.1%. And it can't be from 73 to 83, it grew at 1.6%. But anyway, I guess I need to do some research on that to find out exactly what happened to the agricultural sector in Tunis during that period. Also, manufacturing value added as a percentage of GDP in 2010 for the resource poor, labor abundant countries stood about 15% or 14.4, somewhere around there. But for the resource rich, labor abundant, those who are actually producing oil, stood at a sluggish 6%. So that gives you an idea of how oil may actually affect the manufacturing sector. Now, Iran obviously is an exception. Now, Iran is an oil producing country, but Iran did extremely well, and the Dutch disease pretty much did not affect the Iranian economy. Now, why is that? The reason is very simple, because Iran was under a huge oil embargo. And as a result, Iran exploited the opportunity of having this oil embargo. In other words, it saw huge improvements in its competitive capabilities. And they pretty much diversified their economy. They started to pretty much depend on different sectors rather than the oil sector, simply because of the oil embargo. And this has resulted in the Iranian rial to depreciate tremendously, which made the Iranian goods highly competitive um, compared to other countries' goods. And this obviously gave an impetus for the Iranian economy to pretty much grow at a very rapid rate. So the national industrial sector was strengthened, and manufacturing exports in Iran actually rose as a result of this. So obviously it did have some positive impact on the Iranian economy. But now, there's one thing that we have to question here, and that is what's wrong with an economy that is pretty much dominated by services rather than manufacturing or agriculture? In other words, why do we say that the MENA region is not doing well simply because they are not diversifying their economy? They are depending on services at the expense of manufacturing and agriculture. Now, I'm just asking you, why do you think that is wrong? Why shouldn't the MENA simply focus on services?
There's less infrastructure building for long-term growth and capacity increasing.
Yeah, that's very good. First of all, services as an industry, as a sector, has very, very few linkages to the rest of the economy, whereas manufacturing and agriculture does. So the linkages from agriculture and manufacturing to all different sectors in the economy is extremely strong, whereas services is really not that strong. So now, if we think that, as we should, that oil revenues are temporary and will soon run out, now these countries obviously then would have to transform their economies back to agriculture and or manufacturing. They have no other choice. Now, this structural change will be extremely hard to reverse. In other words, it's very, very difficult to all of a sudden say, okay, we're going to leave services and go back to manufacturing and agriculture. In other words, it's not automatic. So this is going to really take time. It's going to take hard work. It's going to take patience. And it's going to take shifting resources, basically. So it's not an easy thing. So basically, manufacturing is more dynamic than services. Manufacturing, as I said before, has many, many more linkages with the rest of the economy. It employs a large number of skilled workers, and it presents more potential to adapt new technologies. So there is room for improvement. There is room for increasing productivity. There is room, for example, for exporting these goods overseas. So in other words, a larger market, whereas services, you're obviously going to be pretty much limited to your domestic markets. Whereas with agriculture and manufacturing, you have a large international market that you can delve into. So, it provides a lot of opportunities, basically. Also, some countries in the region want to protect their agricultural sector for strategic and national security reasons, i.e. food security. So this is another important reason why you should not neglect the other sectors at the expense of services, because there are reasons. And one of the reasons, as I said right there, food security. Now, the MENA region, of course, is the least food sufficient in the world. In other words, they really have not paid much attention to the agricultural sector. They are least food sufficient. Now, obviously, there are a lot of reasons why. One of them, of course, is the water scarcity. They really don't have enough water. But for some countries in the MENA region, they have ample water. In other words, when you look at Iraq, they have the Euphrates River, which, flows a lot of water. Egypt, Sudan, you have the Nile River. So, I mean, as far as water for those countries is concerned, it's pretty ample. And even with the sometimes you have this political connotations basically that arise as a result of, and I really don't want to go into that. I guess it's something that if we go into it, probably will take 2 or 3 sessions to cover. From the political point of view, right now, for example, with Iraq's river, the Euphrates River, um, they have a lot of problems with Turkey, because Turkey does have, in fact, a way to stop the flow of water from that river for some reason. And Turkey can put, you know, the, in fact, it does have control, in other words, of the flow of water into Iraq. And they can shut off the faucets anytime they want. And this is a big, huge problem, like, what they're doing now. And there is a huge problem between Iraq and Turkey as regards to the supply of water. The same thing, Turkey and Syria. Turkey is doing the same thing to Syria right now. They're shutting off a lot of the water canals that happen to, flow water through the northern Syrian part, because that's where agriculture is pretty much concentrated in Syria, the northern part, which borders with Turkey, basically. That's very, very rich in agriculture. And obviously, Turkey does have some control over the flow of water. So, there is a lot of politics that go into all of this. And if you don't have political stability, if you don't have good working relationship between neighboring countries, in other words, they pretty much um, can negotiate with one another and reach a solution. Unfortunately, in the MENA region or in that part of the world, negotiation is not something that a lot of these countries are accustomed to. And in other words, instead of negotiations, it usually ends up in wars, basically. And, as long as you have this political instability, uh, then a lot of these sectors are going to suffer as a result. And, you're going to have a lot of problems. As I said, so this is basically one of the reasons why, at least agriculture in those regions in the MENA, like Iraq, Syria, etc., have really not done so well. Okay, so how do countries in the MENA region neutralize the Dutch disease? In other words, we know it's a problem. The Dutch disease is a problem for the MENA region, but what steps are these countries taking to actually neutralize this disease? Well, first of all, they can use a large share of their oil revenues to invest in the trading sector to boost productivity. which would lead to lower cost and lower prices, so they can actually compete with the rest of the world, regardless of what happens to their exchange rate. So these countries, they really need to use a lot of those oil revenues to invest in manufacturing, in agriculture, in order to boost productivity, so as to be able to um, have lower costs and lower prices. So the only way you can do that is through productivity, enhancing productivity. Now, the GCC, by the way, they have used a very smart strategy of negating or pretty much neutralizing the Dutch disease. Now, this strategy obviously was not by design, but it just happened by chance, by circumstance, basically. And what is this strategy? This strategy basically alluded to importing a lot of workers from overseas. So, what do you think this would do to the cost of labor?
Could you repeat that? What did they do?
They imported a lot of workers from overseas, foreign workers.
Oh, it would decrease wages then.
Of course, it will decrease wages, lower the cost of labor. And this
Mm-hmm.
would be a good thing, especially for the private sector, because in the GCC, one of their strategy was simply to strengthen the private sector. In other words, they wanted the private sector to take more control of the economy rather than, because that the GCC strategy has always been one of a paternalistic strategy. Basically, it pretty much provided everything for free to its citizens. And they really wanted to change that. And how are they going to change it? By simply giving more leeway to the private sector to start producing goods and services. And obviously, the private sector is not going to give you anything for free. The private sector is going to charge you money for whatever goods or services that they provide for you. So this is basically one of the things that the GCC did. They pretty much imported a lot of workers. And the reason for that was simply to reduce labor costs, encourage the private sector, and become more competitive. Now, also, the other thing that actually worked pretty well for the GCC by making this a policy signature of the GCC to actually importing mass or massive importation of foreign workers. It became the foreign signature of the, I'm sorry, a policy signature of the MENA region. And the good advantage of that was to reduce the demand for non-tradables. Now, what happens when you reduce the demand for non-tradable goods? What happens to the prices of non-tradable?
They'll decrease.
It will decrease. And this is exactly what they want. They want the prices of non-tradables to fall. Now, why would they want that to happen?
So the price of tradables will go up and they can be competitive. Or they'll
Uh,
be more incentivized to be produced, therefore more
yes. And the reason why they want to do that is because they want to shift resources away from non-tradables to tradables. So the only way to do that is by reducing the prices of non-tradables. Because once you reduce the prices of non-tradables relative to the prices of tradables, you will see a shift of resources, capital and labor, shifting away from non-tradables to tradables. And this is exactly what they wanted. So by
Professor, I have a question on how an increase in supply reduces the demand for non-tradables.
how an increase in supply for
An increase of
non-tradables?
supply of labor.
Oh, increase in supply of labor. Well, the thing that the GCC wanted, why they wanted to increase the supply of labor is because this would reduce the cost of labor. That's the main reason. You want to
I
reduce,
understand.
yeah.
I understand the increased supply lowers the wages, but I guess I just had a disconnect of the lower wages reducing the demand for non-tradables relative to tradables.
Oh, okay. Now, what this increase in labor did, foreign labor, now be careful here. We're talking about foreign labor and not domestic labor. Now, foreign labor, the way it works in the GCC countries, under contract, they give them a very small period of time. In other words, they don't give them full residency for a long time. In other words, they're only there for a couple of years and they're out. So why are they doing this? Why aren't they giving them long-term contracts? Because they want to discourage them from demanding non-tradables. In other words, real estate, buying real estate. That's basically it. That's the reason why they wanted to reduce their demand. So they, in fact, encourage them to actually transfer most of their income overseas in remittances. So less money will be available to be used for consuming non-tradables. You see, that's the reason why I said it's a smart strategy. In other words,
I definitely see it now. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it wasn't actually by design, but it just happened that it worked pretty well for the GCC countries. Once you reduce their demand for non-tradables, prices of non-tradables will go down. And as we have seen, most of the workers in the GCC countries are foreign workers. And this is another problem, by the way, that the MENA region would probably face, not now, but 5-10 years down the road, when they are, in fact, what happened in the GCC was something like, how is it? It's like a policy of quid pro quo. You know what that means? Quid pro quo?
I give you something, you give me something.
Exactly. I give you something and you give me something in return. Now, this is something that they did with their own population. In fact, what they did was, we will give you whatever you need in terms of services. It's going to be free social services, subsidized housing, free education. So this is what the government is giving its citizens, right? Now, what are they asking from their citizens? What they're asking from their citizens is, hey, don't make such a big deal that we are importing a lot of workers and they're displacing you from your jobs. You see how this works?
Yeah, I do. Thank
So
you.
I'm going to give you this, but in return, I don't want you to make a big fuss and say, hey, workers are coming in, they're really, displacing us, and we don't need to hear that. But we're going to give you this. But at the same time, let us do what we think is good for the country by importing cheap labor, reducing costs, becoming more competitive, and at the same time, taking advantage of these workers by not making them full residents here. Thus, they will not be purchasing houses here, and they will not be purchasing, big item goods. Big, in other words, high value items such as maybe cars, or I don't know, things that they know that these workers will not be able to get, and simply because they're only there temporary and they're going to leave. So, hey, why not send most of my money overseas, and whatever money I make, I'm going to send it overseas. I'm going to increase my savings overseas so that in a couple of years, 3, 4, 5 years, I'll be able to buy my own home in my country. That's how these workers think, by the way. They want to take their money out so as to be able to live a better life in their homeland. But they need the money, of course, to do that. And the GCC is offering them that opportunity. So again, it's a quid pro quo policy from the GCC countries, and it simply happens to work positively. Now, the reason why I said this can be very short-sighted, myopic on the part of these policymakers, because how long can you depend on cheap foreign labor and having your own citizens become lazy, not acquire new skills, and not do anything, just depend on the government handouts? This can, come to haunt you in 5, 10, 15 years down the road. So this is basically not what you want to do. But it seems like it's working pretty well for the GCC countries. Everyone is happy. Everyone is satisfied. And so again, this above two strategies can lead to a lower inflation, in other words, less spending. So you can see that the foreign workers make up probably about close to maybe 70% of the labor force, if not more. So these foreign workers are pretty much not spending much. They're sending most of their income in remittances overseas. So this obviously is going to put a tamper on inflation. And again, it will neutralize the Dutch disease. So this is basically, everything that we need to say about the oil and its impact in the MENA region in terms of the Dutch disease, of course. And and we have talked obviously about the challenges of the oil sector. And we have said that oil revenues would lead to a reduction of the price of the foreign currency. Large oil revenues to the state will hinder the development of an efficient private sector. So all of these are challenges of the oil effects on development. And we also said that the boom and bust cycle created by the erratic oil prices will hurt economic growth tremendously. Now, all these three channels that I just talked about, large oil revenues to the state, oil revenues leading to a reduction in the price of foreign currency, and 3, the boom and bust cycle created by this erratic oil price. All these 3 will get translated into, number 1, macroeconomic instability and inflation. And number 2, you will see an oversized public sector that is inefficient. And number 3, a private sector that would lack dynamism. And number 4, there will be poor performance by both the agricultural and manufacturing sector. And number 5, you will see very low levels of job creation. Why? Because the service sector pretty much does not create a lot of jobs, not like the agricultural and the manufacturing sector. So all of this obviously happens to be the result of depending on oil revenues. And the Dutch disease, of course, happens to pretty much um, put a lot of pressure on these economies in terms of growth and development. Now, the solution, of course, lies in the implementation of what I call an integrative and coherent, sound macroeconomic policies. In other words, we really have to look at um, stabilizing policies that will smooth the cycle, policies that can avoid external debt um, by simply slowing down government expenditure and leading to less inflation. So monetary policy, fiscal policy are extremely important in trying to negate the Dutch disease. And all of these policies hopefully will control inflation. And also, we need to look at policies that will help diversifying the economy. In other words, we need to think in terms of promoting investment in agriculture and in manufacturing. And we also want to undertake policies that will promote the private sector. Um, Now, the only problems, the way I see it here, the only problems with this type of policies that I just discussed may lie uh, in their political feasibility and desirability. That's basically where we see the problem may actually arise. From the political feasibility and desirability of undertaking such policies. So that's basically, all that I need to talk about. Um, Now, the GCC countries, of course, have done pretty well with the policies that I just discussed. However, the GCC has to be a little bit worried about its distributive model. In other words, this distributive model can create a lot of problems for the GCC countries in the future. Why? Because the distributive model does in fact encourage dependence by the citizens on their government to do everything for them. And as a result, we give them less incentives to acquire new skills, to look for better jobs. In other words, why would I want to do all of that when the government is pretty much providing everything for me? So, something has to change along those things that, the government must, in fact, shy away from such policies. So the distributive model, even though it has some positives, but it also has a lot of negatives. So the government really has to pretty much worry about this. Now, remember last time we said that oil revenues can be very much different from other sources of income. Does anyone remember the reasons why?
Its price is very sporadic, and the demand
Very
increases and
good.
decreases very highly.
Absolutely, absolutely, that's true. And that's basically one. What is the other reason for it? Like you have just said, that's true. That's number one reason. But what do you think the other reasons which would make oil revenues pretty much different from other sources of income?
Would it, Professor, have to do with certain countries' dependency on the resource and their inability to create it? So, like in agricultural senses, most countries have some type of capability of growing some type of food, but because of the nature of oil, it's not something that can be produced everywhere. So they can then inflate the price, and like they can be more manipulative with it than other resources.
Very good. Excellent. Yeah, that's another good reason. Absolutely. Anyone else? I guess we did talk about this last time. Um, how about the boom and bust cycles of oil? This obviously is going to hurt the development process, especially economic growth. And this makes a huge difference in as far as the prices of manufacturing goods, which are not subject to this boom and bust. Whereas oil prices are pretty much um, subject to all these fluctuations, erratic fluctuations in prices. So that's basically another reason why. And then, of course, the accrual of this large oil revenues to the state, as I explained several times before, will obviously hinder the development of an efficient private sector, basically. So those are some of the things that will make oil revenue to be a very different source of income from other products or other sectors. Now, the expansion of the oil sector, of course, as we said, it reduces the price of foreign currencies. That's the Dutch disease, hurting the productive sectors. And obviously, we are not able to compete with the rest of the world as a result of the Dutch disease, basically. In other words, it makes our goods a lot more expensive than foreign goods. So obviously, we are at a disadvantage here when it comes to competition. So that's basically everything that we need to say about this. And I guess together with the notes that I've given you, it really should summarize everything that we need to know about the impact of oil on development, the Dutch disease, what the Dutch disease is, and how it has affected the MENA region, and what have countries done to negate the Dutch disease. Have these strategies been successful, or have they failed entirely? So we can see with the GCC countries, of course, it has done wonders. But with other countries, it really, the policies that were instituted didn't really work very well to negate or to mute the effects of the Dutch disease. So, it depends. Experiences are different among different countries in the MENA regions. Some have done extremely well, others have not done so well. But again, one of the things that we want to talk about, probably in the subsequent chapters that are coming, especially in chapter 13, is that the MENA region countries happen to always be working in isolation. In other words, they have never taken the integrative approach to solving problems, to learning from one another, to not reinvent the wheel. A lot of these things are missing and lacking. And this is one of the problems that the MENA region happens to be facing today. It's their inability to come together as a unit and find ways to solve a lot of the mutual problems. In other words, all these problems, economic problems, are pretty much mutual for all of them. Because the region, as I said, again, it has a lot that unites them than divides them in terms of culture, in terms of language, in terms of history. So, there is a lot that unites them than, in fact, divides them. And one of the most important things is the language. They all speak one language. They all, listen to the same music, I guess. They all eat the same food, basically. So the language, the culture, um, all of these traits and characteristics should be able to unite them. And but unfortunately, the region still remains fragmented. The region still has not reached a political consensus. And again, you find countries fighting with one another for political reasons more than anything else. Of course, has nothing to do with economic. It's mainly political. And unfortunately, this is where the MENA region stands right now. And more cooperation, more integration, not political. You don't have to have political integration, but for God's sake, at least have some economic integration, to move the region forward. And, the region has enough resources to feed the whole MENA population, even the poor countries in the MENA region. In other words, all the resources that should be distributed. I mean, I am the one that believes that the resources in the MENA region, it really depends. It really belongs to the whole region as a whole. In other words, we can't just think of oil in Saudi Arabia belonging only to Saudi Arabia, oil in Libya belonging only to Libya. If we think in those terms, then that region will never go and advance. But we really have to think in terms of integrating our actions and doing something that benefits the whole region, because if one country does well, believe me, all the other countries would do very well. If one country does poorly, this would pull the other countries down with it. So we really have to have some sort of economic harmony, political harmony, to be able to move the region and advance it forward. And I guess this is some of the things that are lacking. So that's why we call this political economy, because it has to do a lot with economics and politics, basically. It all has to do with production, consumption, and the distribution of income. How are you going to distribute it, basically? That's what political economy is all about. Okay, so I'm going to leave it right there. If there are any questions, we just have 1 minute left.
Professor, quick question. On the class presentation part 2, are we keeping this specific topic we did last time? So the region we did, so like we did the Arab Spring in Yemen. Is my group specifically talking about Yemen for question 1, or are we generalizing the answer?
Well, as I said before, it would be better to take a specific example, because when you take a specific example, there is more information that you can add. There is more data that you can bring to us.
Okay.
So focus on a country or like a few countries rather than have it generalized.
Right, exactly, right.
Okay.
So, I'd rather have you be more specific. So at least, we can learn something. We can come out with something and say, hey, this is what happened to this country. This is why it didn't do well or why it did well. And, it's a lot easier to refer to one particular country rather than a region.
Would that be for all 3 questions, or would that be more specific to question 1? Because I'm doing question 2 with my group, and it's just the missing links of economic integration. And I was wondering if that would be applied to the whole region, or if we'd want us to do like a specific country on how they've managed to develop or not develop, depending on what country we are doing.
That's what I would like you to do. I would like you to pick one country that really has not participated or has not involved itself in any type of economic integration, whether within the region or outside the region. Now, some countries have done an excellent job of integrating with the EEC or with the European community. And they were able to get a lot of benefits from those trade treaties. So they were able to open up their economy to the outside world. Other countries have not done that, and they pretty much paid the price. So yes, I think if you could find countries that were able to open up and participate in trade agreements versus countries that did not, I think, you know, it would pretty much add to what we probably would learn.
Okay, so for part 2, you recommend us comparing 2 countries,
Mhm.
one that participated and one that failed.
Correct. Good.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
absolutely. Any other questions?
For those comparisons for question 2, sorry, but last presentation, my group did Qatar, and I'm pretty sure that they were very successful in implementing these economic reforms. They have a very large amount of foreign workers, so I feel like that'd be one that would fall into the success column.
Right.
And so it take them and compare their growth and development trajectories to that of, like, let's say Tunisia. Would that
Correct.
fall into the other category, or were they both considered successful?
Yeah, you could look at one country that was successful and one country that actually was a failure. That's the best way to compare them.
Okay, I just didn't want to like do 2 countries, like one that I thought was successful when turns out to be a failure, or like 2 countries that I think are successful and none of them are successful. So I just wanted to know that the country that I picked fall
Sure.
into the right category.
That's fine. Yeah. As long as you can explain what you're trying to do, and as long as you can give us your results. I mean, what were your findings? I mean, that's all we're interested in, basically. So it really doesn't matter which country you take or which one you're comparing with which. At least tell us, what are you trying to do by picking or selecting those countries in the first place?
Well, thank you, Professor. Have a good week.
You too. Take care now.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too. So I guess if there are no more questions, I need to leave because I have one more class right after this one.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. Take care, everyone. I will see you on, well, I guess the presentations are going to start next week, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'll be looking forward to your presentations. I'm sure you will do a good job as you did last time. So yeah, I will be looking forward to that. Okay, guys, take care now and have a nice weekend, all of you. And I'll see you on Tuesday. Bye-bye.